And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? Jim, we are at another emergency, maybe not quite an emergency, hopefully not an emergency podcast, talking about the South China Sea again. They're brought to you, of course, by our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia, and our producer, IEJ Media. We'll tell you more about both of them in due course. I'm Ray Powell, the former military officer here in California. Over there in New York is Jim Carouso, the former diplomat. Jim, I didn't think we'd already be back talking just you and me about the South China Sea.
Well, apparently the Chinese appreciated our podcast so much last time, they wanted to have us do another one.
Oh, so it's our fault.
Usually.
Just check their propaganda.
That's right. They need more things to throw at you. So essentially, since our last podcast, they have upped their ante in activity around Second Thomas Shoal, especially, but also Scarborough Shoal. So why don't you describe what you've been seeing, what you've been tracking the past week or so, and why you're concerned to get me up on a Sunday afternoon?
Get you up on a Sunday afternoon? Is this early for you? Anyway. So when last we talked about this subject, we were talking about this collision at Scarborough Shoal, which happened, of course, on the 11th of August. Well, on the 12th of August, without too much notice, all of a sudden, China began to move a bunch of ships from the area around Mischief Reef over to Second Thomas Shoal. So the geography here looks like this. Down in the Spratly Archipelago, which is this vast archipelago that kind of encompasses the lower part of the South China Sea, there is the West Philippine Sea, which is closest to the Philippines, in which all of this takes place. Way to the north, like 350 nautical miles to the north, is where Scarborough Shoal is, all by its little lonesome, and that's where the collision took place. So this was nowhere close to the collision. And of course, since the collision, you've had to have the China Coast Guard ship limp back to China. You've had, dueling propaganda going back and forth. And then you have, just sort of, for some reason, these ships moving on Second Thomas Shoal. Now, Second Thomas Shoal, a year ago, last June, was the site of this drama where there were screaming Coast Guardsmen and bladed weapons drawn right next to this rusty ship, the BRP Sierra Madre. Philippine Navy SEAL lost his thumb. We sort of came to the brink of real, shooting conflict. And both sides kind of pulled back after that, and they came to some odd arrangement, which they sort of both announced in their own terms. Well, China announced that the Philippines agreed to all their terms, and the Philippines announced that China agreed to all their terms, and both sides seem to be okay with the dissonance. So everything around the resupply missions to the rusty ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, had been quiet ever since then until now.
Okay. So you're drawing a line between the activity at Scarborough Shoal and what's going around Second Thomas Shoal right now, Second Thomas Reef.
Second Thomas Shoal, yep.
Yeah. So why do you come to that conclusion? Just because something's happening after the gentleman's agreement had been reached?
Well, no. So because the timing is sort of stark, right? So the collision happens on the 11th. And the ships begin to move toward Second Thomas Shoal on the 12th. So it looked to me at the time like China just wants to change the subject. And I'm sure that's true to a degree. So I think that that's almost certainly part of the explanation, is this incident with the two Chinese ships colliding at Scarborough Shoal was a very, very public embarrassment, the kind that Beijing hates with a white-hot passion. And so what better way to turn the page, not just turn the page, but also punish the Philippines for their role in the collision, being the ship that was running away from the other two ships. What better way to punish and turn the page than to sort of have something new happening back at our old friend, Second Thomas Shoal?
So have they actually interrupted this resupply mission or not?
Not that we can tell. So that one of the things that's remarkable is since this agreement was reached, the resupply missions have mostly gone along almost unnoticed because there has not been any drama. There have not been. So back before, say starting, before June of last year, we all knew when there was going to be a resupply, because all of a sudden we'd see all these Chinese ships move to Second Thomas Shoal. And then you'd see some Philippine Coast Guard, vastly outnumbered, sort of array themselves, move in that direction. Then we'd sort of see the swarming and all of these things. And then the pictures would come back and the video. It was all extremely public. Since the arrangement was reached, they basically just have a very quiet boat that goes out, comes back. There might be an announcement afterwards, say, we did what they call a RORI, a rotation and resupply. They would rotate the troops and they would resupply the ship. And so those have happened almost completely unnoticed ever since June of last year. So one of the big questions here is China has been now swarming Second Thomas Shoal since the 12th of August. And the swarm...
Well, what does swarming mean? What does that look like?
It's basically bringing in a lot of ships. Now, okay, so to be fair, sometimes we use swarming in different ways. Oftentimes we talk about swarming as a bunch of ships swarming another ship that's underway. So, for example, a Philippine Coast Guard ship gets swarmed by a bunch of China Coast Guard and maritime militia ships so that it can't move. In this case, we've had a swarming into Second Thomas Shoal. And Second Thomas Shoal is sort of shaped like a big closed fish hook, or almost like a carabiner, I guess, if you're one of these clips. If our audio viewers will appreciate this, one of these clips that you clip to your belt, and there's only one way in, and that's the way to resupply the ship. And so, in order to get in and do the resupply, you have to go through this very narrow passage along the eastern side, and China has recently been stationing ships occasionally inside to make sure that the Philippines doesn't try something sneaky, right? So, because the only way to get in and resupply, because if you try to get approached from the outside, the grounded ship with the BRP Sierra Madre is grounded on the inside. So that makes it very hard to get at from the outside. So what we see right now, looking at the most recent satellite imagery, is say half a dozen Chinese ships in the middle of the shoal, just as kind of like a last line of defense. And so this would do a couple of things. One, it would keep the Philippines from trying anything. And at the same time, it is there to menace and intimidate the crew of the Sierra Madre.
So they are right there in front of the Sierra Madre.
Yeah. And it's not just, so it's, again, I've seen a number of different estimates. You can't see everything using overhead imagery and tracking and automatic information systems. But, you're looking at probably at least half a dozen China Coast Guard ships and maybe twice that of maritime militia. Plus, you're going to have all of these, what we call rigid hulled inflatable boats, or RHIBs. So these are basically Zodiac boats or dark rafts with a big motor in the, rigid hulled raft with a big motor in the back, very large raft, which are very nimble and can go all around the shoal. And they've got, we've seen numbers that look like 15, 16, 17 of these things.
And these things are armed.
Yes. And so one of the things that's come out in some of the pictures that we've seen from the Armed Forces of the Philippines is that not only are they armed, they've actually got sort of crew-mounted weapons. So like if you think of, if you have, let's say, a Humvee going through the desert, you might have a guy with a small arm, and that's a danger in itself. But you might have the guy sitting on the top with this mounted weapon like a machine gun, and that's what we've seen on the front of some of these RHIBs. So it's more than your standard intimidation.
Okay. Has China announced this activity? Have they tried to say what they're up to?
Well, so the way that worked was first the Armed Forces of the Philippines put out a number of pictures and some video of these. So you saw some of the China Coast Guard ship basically doing water cannon practice, which is a little bit of a message in itself, just kind of shooting that water cannon out there, letting them know that exists, moving around. And then some of these smaller boats approached the Sierra Madre, which of course is the Philippines outpost. And there's only like a dozen or so, usually only about a dozen or so Philippine Marines.
All right. Now, define approach.
So they came up. So my understanding is, say within 50 meters or so of the ship, enough so the Philippine side felt compelled to go out in their own boats and sort of meet them there just to try to keep them away from the outpost. Now, so this all happens. And then after the Philippines puts out these pictures, China, as they have become very good at doing now, puts out their own version of events with their own video. So China has learned from the Philippine video. They want to have their own video. And they've put out these propaganda pieces that say, actually, this was all the Philippines intimidating or trying to provoke us by coming up in the direction of our boat. So, of course, the Philippines did that to keep their Coast Guard vessel away from the Sierra Madre, and instead, of course, and then this is normal now, right? I mean, we've seen it even since the collision. We talked about it last time. They quickly got the videos out from the Global Times, other Chinese state media, saying this was all caused because the Philippine boat, the 44-meter Philippine boat, while running away from the 100+ meter Chinese ships, was behaving erratically and dangerously.
Okay, so we've upped the activity around the Sierra Madre, which has been a bugbear for the Chinese for a long, long time.
Yes, since 1999. And I think that's an important point. So the history of the BRP Sierra Madre is in 1994, the Chinese erected what they called fishing huts at Mischief Reef. So Mischief Reef is 30 nautical miles to the west of Second Thomas Shoal, still very much in the middle of the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And they put these fishing huts there. And eventually what the Philippines notice, and there is a bit of a kerfuffle around that, and there's lots of things going back and forth. But the Philippines at that point was in a very weak position. The U.S. bases had been drawn down in the early 90s. So there was sort of this realignment happening. The Philippines was sort of a little bit out on its own. And so in sort of a desperation to do something, what they did was they took one of these World War II ships that had been given to it by the United States, BRP, which they renamed the BRP Sierra Madre, and they drove it into Second Thomas Shoal and grounded it there. And it's been there ever since. So it's been there now for 26 years. And from the very beginning, China has hated that ship. And to get into China's mindset about this, or at least its public mindset, to what it says, for China, for them to take Mischief Reef, which was a reef with some fishing huts on it, and build it into a huge port and airfield, basically a huge military base, that's all fine. But for the Philippines to have this one ship and to do anything to reinforce that ship or even to maintain that ship, the fact that the ship is there at all, that is definitely not fine.
Because it's Chinese territory, man.
Well, that's right. So within the 9-dash line, et cetera, absolutely. And, what you're starting to see more and more now is in all the Chinese propaganda, you see the word China's before. So in this case, their term for Second Thomas Shoal is Renai Reef or Renai Jiao. So they say China's Renai Jiao, right? So it's always China's this, China's Huangyangdao, which is Scarborough Shoal. It's always China's this. So China has consolidated control of Scarborough Shoal. They've consolidated control of Sabina Shoal since we had that Philippine Coast Guard anchor there late last year. That was around the 60 Minutes time when we had 60 Minutes out there. They've basically kept the Philippines away from Sandy Cay, which is this little marker, this little sandbar near the Philippine island of Titu Island, which is the only civilian population in the South China Sea. So we've got China has been kind of reacting and building up its control throughout the West Philippine Sea, and yet there's still this one ship that they just cannot get rid of.
Okay, so the ship is there, now they're harassing it or trying to make a point or something. The timing is suspicious because it's a week after all the problems up at Scarborough Shoal. Do we think that's the timing, that's the issue that's ramped up now, or is there something else?
So here's what I think. What we know is that China has been essentially trying to provoke the Philippines into somebody making a mistake. Essentially, so the Philippine soldiers, the Philippine Marines, Philippine Coast Guard, they're all under strict instructions to exercise restraint, and they have been unbelievable They've been extremely professional. They've been extremely restrained. But you'll notice that anytime, so even last June, there was talk about, well, one of the Philippines brandished a weapon. Well, they're Marines in a military outpost. What do you think they have, right? But they really, in some ways, China would like nothing better than for the Philippines to take a shot at them, because they are looking for a pretext to do what they wanted to do all along. And if they can sell this just enough as a Philippine provocation, then they think maybe they can get away with something, whether it be a full-on, seizure of the, assault on the Sierra Madre, whether it be, laying of siege, whatever it is that they have in mind, something to essentially show that the Philippines was at fault. We're just here restoring order. We're the reasonable ones. And by the way, it's not important if everybody believes it. In fact, almost nobody will believe it. What's important is it's just plausible enough so that the people who really just want the whole thing to go away will just say, let's just stay out of it.
Okay, my turn to wildly speculate.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the other activity in the past few weeks has been the US-Taiwan relations, where President Lai is not allowed to transit through New York on his way to South America. 20% tariffs on Taiwan. A lot of criticism by President Trump of Taiwan for not having sufficient defense spending, for stealing the semiconductor industry from the U.S. Anyway, US-Taiwan relations are a little more fraught than they were just a few months ago. So that's one. Two, remember just a week ago, President Trump goes to Anchorage, meets with Vladimir Putin, a man famous for taking other people's territory. And despite the president saying on his way, I need a ceasefire, I'll be very unhappy, comes away with no ceasefire, no agreement on anything, sanctions India for buying Russian oil, but interestingly, no sanctions on Russia. In fact, there are no tariffs, increased tariffs on Russian goods exports to the U.S. So if I'm Xi, and I know if I'm Xi that Trump really wants a trade deal with me, and he just extended another 90-day period for negotiating a trade deal. So all these factors seem to indicate to me, I'm going to see how far I can push this.
Well, I mean, look, Jim, I can't really argue with any of that. And we know from our discussion not long ago with Zach Cooper, that when Zach went to China last and had some conversations with some think tankers there is a supreme confidence that runs through a lot of the Chinese system, and maybe a little bit of a sense that that the old Trump always chickens out vibe is accepted. Zach was saying he thought that the strikes in Iran might cool that off a little bit. The question is that enough, right? So, all you're looking for if you're trying to take the temperature of China, which of course is very hard to do, is you're looking for them to have just enough confidence to push just a little further. So we don't think that there exists the will right this minute or the capability to do something major, say cross-strait against Taiwan. But there are lots of things short of that. And again, the other thing is when we talk about, and we've had these discussions before talking about deterrence, in order to deter your adversary, you have to convince them of two things. One is that you have the will, and two is that you have the capability to cause them real pain if they do something that you don't like. So the question is, do they buy that the U.S. has A, the will, and B, the capability to stop them, to do something bad to them, sufficiently bad so it won't be worth the effort? Because if they are seen to get away with something like storming the Sierra Madre or something to that effect, and the U.S. fails to, or appears to fail to honor its treaty commitments, that would be almost like Christmas for China. I mean, that's everything they want. They would like to see a fundamental break with the treaty commitment that the U.S. has to one of its treaty allies, because then every single one of those treaty allies is going to say, what does that mean for me?
Well, this has been the theme for us since we started this gig, a year and a half ago, whatever it is?
Yeah, almost.
and it's been our biggest concern. And
by the way, just to be fair, we've had this concern across administrations, right? I mean, there were criticisms that we had of the Biden administration for some of their failure to follow through and those kinds of things. I think that what's new here is this intense transactionalism coming out of this administration, where these deals are made kind of almost with deterrence, not even as an afterthought, but not as a thought at all.
Well, the other thing we're hearing is we know the South Korean president is coming to visit President Trump this week. It's August 23rd today. Yep. On the table, apparently, is discussion of pulling some troops out of South Korea, charging South Korea more for those troops, having those troops focus more in China, maybe. We don't know exactly. But again, There could be a transactional element that causes a concern among the alliance system we have in Asia.
Sure. And we know that the relationship, with this new administration in South Korea is much more fragile, I would say, because it tends to be more of a U.S. skeptical, you might say, or at least alliance skeptical administration. And you have not seen warm and fuzzy discussions between the two sides. So yes, I mean, we could certainly hope that they would come out with some strong language and some positive momentum forward. But all of these, Jim, all of these summits are such a high wire act because you just don't know. When you and I were doing these things, you kind of knew the outcome of every presidential summit before it happened, because
it was scripted.
Months would go into what are the deliverables? What are we going to walk out? I mean, and you would have long meetings with the other side saying, okay, we're going to get all of the things exactly. Everything was scripted, with some rare exceptions, one of which maybe I can tell you later. But for the most part, all of the outcomes were foreordained. And here, it's almost like none of the outcomes are we have just no idea what's coming out of any of these things. And I think that Donald Trump believes that he has extra leverage and he can use his deal making skills and those kinds of things. He can form personal bonds, all of the things that I think he believes about himself. But it is for the entire apparatus that's set up to make sure that you get a positive outcome. That apparatus is almost completely shut out of this thing.
That is correct. And certainly when he meets with she will be very well prepared and know exactly what he wants. He cannot be bullied. And I think and what we're hearing occasionally is our allies are concerned that a grand deal is still in the offing, which will sell them down the river. Now, I don't really believe that because it would make them look so weak, but it's a concern. I tend to think in the end, what will end up happening kind of like with the Putin summit is we'll all get whiplash, because we'll have one summit and everything will seem to be moving in one direction. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't. And then all of a sudden, Volodymyr Zelensky and half a dozen Europeans show up in the White House and you've got a whole different thing. And so, I think that's what we're watching. And that is, I think, what we're just going to have to continue to expect, because, Donald Trump's not going to change. He's been 80 years in the making. He's kind of who he is. Is he ever? So
we get back to Second Thomas Shoal. I think I'm mostly thinking that China is on an extended probe and, testing the Philippines limits and maybe, the alliance a little bit. But I've got a couple caveats. One is I think there is a part of their approach that is looking for something to happen and would be very happy if the Philippines gave them an excuse. And so what is China's plan if that something does happen? If they get the right pretext and they believe this is their time, I think that we could see them move, right? I mean, they have had plans for this. Now, I think that for a long time, they were just hoping that ship would just break up and slide into the ocean, and it has failed to do so. And perhaps in part because the Philippines succeeded in reinforcing it somewhat over the past few years. So now they're sort of stuck with it, and yet they, they succeeded in consolidating control around Scarborough Shoal, even if their ships did run into each other. They succeeded around Sabina Shoal. They've had some success around Sandy Cay. Why not? This is the one thing that they have not been able to get from the Philippines that they really, really want. So why not now? And so I fear that there's a certain amount of that. And by the way, just the fact that they were so publicly humiliated by their own doing, to be fair, but they were so publicly humiliated by this collision that was, again, caught on camera, almost live, right?
Well, did we make it worse by doing a freedom of navigation operation very soon thereafter, right by the Scarborough?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Obviously, it is important. I think in some senses, it is important for that they see from the Allied superpower, they see something, right? The Philippines is sort of used to, and everybody's kind of used to, every single time one of these things happens, the U.S. comes out with a very similar statement. Our ironclad, I think the Philippines is getting tired of the word ironclad commitment to our treaty obligations, blah, 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 right? And, a bunch of these other statements come in. So I think in some ways, I think it was very important for them to see, gray-hulled United States flag waving, warships go very close in by the area. Now, freedom of navigation operations are, of course, not supposed to be whipped out for specific messaging. They're supposed to be a worldwide program that's happened over 4+ decades. And we just, so you'd like to be able to say, yeah, we plan to do that all along, right? And we do it all over the world. And we do it all over the world. We do it to everyone. But this one seems to have been a little special. Still, I do think that there's an important thing to do there, which is to show that we are still committed to our ally. But, so is it more provocative? And this is the age old question. Is it more provocative or is it more of a deterrent? And your mileage may vary.
Well,
so what else are we looking forward to? We are looking forward to the question of, does China, so they're moving more iron, at least in the form of maritime militia as of today, into the area. Basically, there have been a bunch of these ships that were over at Union Banks off to the west, and they move 4 more of them, at least that I can see, over by Mischief Reef, which is a lot closer, and they're just sort of arrayed in the area. So that's alarming because it means that China is not pulling back, that perhaps they're doubling down a little bit. So what else is next? I don't know. So then the next thing that worries me is, as you mentioned, they do have to resupply the ship. And will China allow that to happen this time without demanding additional concessions? Because I could easily see China saying, yeah, I'm sorry, that old agreement we had, you guys made us mad, so that one's off now. We want more. Of course, nobody knows what exactly was in that old agreement because it was sort of secret, and both sides got to claim that the other side gave in. But China may feel it has the whip hand now. The reason that they didn't move on the ship, of course, as I mentioned, was the Mutual Defense Treaty. They don't want to give the armed attack. It's Article 4 says that there's an armed attack, the other comes to the aid, right? So why don't they just lay siege? Well, it's not a pretty sight to see, a dozen Marines die of starvation. That's probably not, it's not like the world is going to just sit back and watch that happen. And believe me, there will be lots of pictures of that if they tried that. So siege is not really a good option. They were able to do it at Sabina Shoal because in the end, they knew that ship was seaworthy and it could always go home. At Second Thomas Shoal, that ship is not seaworthy. It is not going anywhere. And if you don't resupply it, those people die. So I don't think a siege is in the offing, but I'm not so sure that there won't be something else, either some kind of a muscular move on the ship or something to make the resupply much, much more difficult.
Do you have an estimate on when the next resupply would be due?
I don't. So we used to see these things happen when they happened. I have no idea when the last one was because they now happen sort of without any announcement or ship tracking or anything. So I don't know.
Right, you're supposed to know everything, but okay.
So, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, just on the way out, I'll tell you my story of when we didn't know what was going to come out of a presidential summit. So President Obama in 2016 came to Hanoi, and one of my military comrades was charged with finding a lunch venue for President Obama on a particular day. So, this is how finally this thing gets broken down. If you're in charge of the lunch venue, that becomes your whole world when it's around a presidential visit, right? So, he worked very hard. He came up with all these options. He sent them all up. They were all gone over by all the staff, and everybody picked them apart. This took up weeks of his life. And then President Obama shows up, and guess where he goes to lunch? He goes to have buncha with Anthony Bourdain, something nobody knew was going to happen basically until he got there. So the White House planned this entire thing. And by the way, it was brilliant. I mean, it was these two guys sitting around this, $6 meal, drinking a Vietnamese beer and eating essentially noodles and beef. And it was in a very, very ordinary noodle shop. It wasn't sort of bottom of the line, but it was, ordinary, and fantastic visuals. And frankly, after he left, that's all anybody could talk about. I'd say I'd meet somebody on the street and I'd say, yeah, I work at the embassy. And they go, oh, Obama, buncha. And yeah, we actually had deliverables that nobody paid any attention to because all they could remember is that Obama ate buncha. But yeah, so that was the one thing out of that presidential visit that was kept from us and we didn't plan for. And my friend had to work very hard to do something that was actually no use whatsoever. And they knew it.
Right, well, I can tell a story in the future about Obama in Australia with the China connection, but that's for next time.
All right, we'll do that next time. In the meantime, we'll say thank you to our fantastic producer, Ian Ellis Jones. Please make sure you watch him and keep track of him on X at Ian Ellis Jones. That's his handle, at Ian Ellis Jones. You'll be treated to all of his military and geopolitical graphics. Meanwhile, you should visit our sponsor. Our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. Jim Carouso, my co-host, is a senior advisor with Bauer Group. Please visit their website at BauerGroupAsia.com. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and follow. I believe my daughter was telling me this morning, because she looks at YouTube more than I do, that our YouTube followers are somewhere around 40,000, which isn't bad. We'd like to see it twice that. So please go out there and make sure you subscribe. You can find us at youtube.com at IP Podcast. That's youtube.com at IP Podcast. Of course, if you heard all about this and you weren't really keeping up with the thing at Scarborough Shoal, go back 2 episodes and listen to our emergency episode 94, about the Chinese ship collision there. You can, of course, email us at our email address, indopacificpodcast@gmail.com, and please visit our sponsor at BauerGroupAsia.com. For Jim and Ian, I'm Ray. Thanks for joining us this time, and please join us next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?